A nation born in revolution tears itself apart over the meaning of freedom itself. From the first shots at Fort Sumter to Lee's surrender at Appomattox, witness America's bloodiest conflict that claimed over 600,000 lives and forever transformed a divided republic. Follow Lincoln's desperate struggle to preserve the Union against brilliant Confederate generals like Lee and Jackson. Experience the horror of Shiloh, the turning point at Gettysburg, and Sherman's destructive march to the sea. Beyond the battlefields, discover how enslaved people seized their own liberation, how civilians endured starvation and devastation, and how emancipation redefined American liberty for generations to come. Smoke from hearths curled over small Virginia farms, where enslaved hands tilled tobacco fields, just as their forebears had done since the first Africans were brought to Jamestown in 1619. In the rice swamps of South Carolina, chains clinked in the mud as men and women bent under the southern sun, their labor transforming wetlands into fortunes. From these beginnings, bondage had spread like ivy across the American landscape, entwining itself into every debate about land, law, and liberty. As the nation grew, the question of slavery's reach shadowed every step. When Missouri petitioned for admission in 1819, the balance between free and slave states teetered. Senators argued late into the night, counting votes as though the Union itself might be tallied by columns of numbers. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a fragile line across the map, promising that slavery would not creep north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. It was a paper peace, one that muffled but did not end the quarrel. For 3 decades, that compromise held like a brittle dam, yet new lands poured into the Republic, first from Louisiana's purchase, then from victory over Mexico. Each acre carried the same urgent question: would these soils echo with the songs of free laborers or the cries of the enslaved? Every congressional session brought fresh storms. The debates were not only about maps, but about the nation's soul. The Compromise of 1850 tried to patch the fractures again. California entered free, while the territories of New Mexico and Utah were left to decide their fate by popular sovereignty. At the heart of this arrangement lay the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that forced even those who despised slavery to become its enforcers. In northern towns, free black families feared the knock of marshals at midnight, while white neighbors recoiled at being compelled to return men and women to bondage. Runaway notices filled newspapers, and the Underground Railroad became more than whispers. It became a lifeline of hidden attics, coded songs, and brave conductors like Harriet Tubman, who guided fugitives across dark fields toward freedom. The law radicalized many who had once kept silent. Abolitionists multiplied their meetings, their presses thundered with pamphlets, and fiery orators filled halls from Boston to Chicago. William Lloyd Garrison declared slavery a sin that must be ended without compromise. Frederick Douglass, scarred by the lash yet armed with words sharp as steel, spoke with the authority of one who had lived the whip and survived. Each voice added fuel to a blaze that compromise could no longer contain. Meanwhile, the nation's two halves pulled further apart in ways beyond politics. In the factories of Lowell and Pittsburgh, smoke belched from chimneys, locomotives screamed across iron rails, and the hum of machinery announced an industrial future. Northern cities swelled with immigrants who worked long shifts but found freedom in their wages. By contrast, the South remained tied to its great plantations, fields of cotton stretching white as snow under the summer sun. Wealth concentrated in the hands of planters, whose mansions stood as monuments to human bondage. Two cultures had taken root in the same republic, one urban, restless, and forward-looking, the other rural, hierarchical, and bound to the soil through enslaved labor. This divide sharpened when Stephen Douglas pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress in 1854. It erased the old Missouri line, leaving new territories to decide for themselves whether to embrace slavery. The result was not orderly self-government, but bleeding Kansas. Settlers poured in with rifles as well as plows, determined to fix the territory's fate by force. Border ruffians from Missouri crossed rivers to stuff ballot boxes and intimidate opponents, while abolitionist settlers raised their own militias. Cabin roofs smoldered, printing presses were smashed, and gunfire crackled across prairies where farmers had once only feared drought or locusts. The violence proved that compromise was dead. On the floor of the Senate itself, passions turned to blood when Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina struck Charles Sumner of Massachusetts with a cane until the chamber rang with horror. The attack symbolized the nation's descent from words to weapons. Courts joined the fray with decisions that deepened division. In 1857, the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford declared that black men could claim no rights a white man was bound to respect, and that Congress had no authority to bar slavery from the territories. The judgment struck free states like a thunderclap. To many Northerners, it proved that slave power had seized not just Southern soil, but the very machinery of justice. In the streets, resistance took forms both humble and bold. Escaped slaves told their stories to Northern crowds, forcing audiences to confront the scars, chains, and families torn apart. Secret societies smuggled fugitives across the Ohio River, while in Southern newspapers, editors railed against these criminal conspiracies that threatened their way of life. Every escape was both a victory for liberty and an insult to slaveholders' honor, widening the rift. Then came John Brown, the gaunt figure whose eyes burned with apocalyptic certainty. After shedding blood in Kansas, he struck at Harper's Ferry in 1859, hoping to spark a general uprising of the enslaved. His raid failed, his men scattered or killed, and Brown himself went to the gallows with Bible in hand. Yet his words before execution, declaring that the crimes of slavery could be purged only with blood, rang in Northern ears long after the rope tightened. To the South, he was proof that abolitionists would stop at nothing. To the North, he became a martyr whose calm courage foreshadowed the struggles to come. By the eve of the 1860 election, the Union stood like a house split down the middle. Each compromise had been a bandage on a wound that never closed. In city streets and plantation parlors alike, men argued whether the Republic could endure half slave and half free. Railroads and rivers carried more than cotton and coal. They carried rumors of secession, whispers of war, and the certainty that the old balances could not hold forever. The storm gathered, waiting only for the spark that would ignite it. That spark would come with an election, but the fuse had been laid long before. In every lash of the whip, every runaway flight, every compromise signed in desperation. A nation that had once prided itself on liberty now stood on the brink of testing whether that liberty could survive its own contradictions. In the autumn of 1860, banners fluttered from balconies, brass bands played in crowded squares, and Americans argued with a passion that spilled from taverns to parlors, from city streets to frontier cabins. The nation prepared to choose its 16th president, but few believed the decision would pass like any ordinary election. The stakes were nothing less than the Union itself. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois carried the Republican banner. Tall, angular, with a face furrowed by years of prairie life, he was not the polished figure of Eastern politics, but a man whose words carried conviction shaped by struggle. His party's platform pledged to halt the spread of slavery into new territories. It did not yet call for abolition where the institution already existed, but Southerners heard only the promise of restriction, a tightening vice that threatened their future. Lincoln's rise had been swift. Just 2 years earlier, his debates with Stephen Douglas had revealed a voice capable of piercing through political fog. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he had warned. And though many considered the words prophetic, slave-holding leaders heard them as a threat. To their ears, Lincoln's election meant not merely a political setback, but the beginning of their destruction. The Democratic Party, once the nation's great unifier, shattered on the very issue Lincoln embodied. Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, champion of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats broke away, choosing John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who pledged unyielding defense of slavery's expansion. A fourth party, the Constitutional Unionists, rallied behind John Bell of Tennessee, urging compromise and harmony, though the hour for harmony was long past. Campaigning filled the land with pamphlets, speeches, and newspapers thick with rhetoric. In northern cities, Lincoln's name was cheered, as crowds hailed him as a man of humble origins who embodied the free labor ideal. In Charleston and Montgomery, however, his name was hissed, equated with abolitionist plots to destroy Southern life. The contest revealed not one nation debating its future, but two regions speaking different languages of fear and hope. When the ballots were counted in November, Lincoln secured the presidency with no votes from the Deep South. His support came almost entirely from northern and western states. For millions in the South, the result confirmed their darkest suspicions. They were now ruled by a section that sought to cage their institution and eventually eradicate it. The response came with startling speed. On December 20th, 1860, delegates in South Carolina gathered in Charleston's Institute Hall and voted unanimously for secession. Bells rang, cannons boomed, and crowds paraded through the streets with banners proclaiming liberty from northern domination. Fireworks lit the night sky, not in celebration of the Union, but in jubilation for leaving it. One by one, other states followed. Mississippi declared that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon joined, each issuing declarations that tied their withdrawal to fears that Lincoln's government threatened both slavery and honor. By February 1861, the Deep South had broken away, forming a new nation on American soil. In Montgomery, representatives of the seceded states gathered to draft a constitution. They named Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as their president. Davis was no firebrand. He preferred caution and spoke with the gravity of a man who understood the dangers ahead. Yet his presence lent the Confederacy legitimacy, a sense that their cause had sober statesmen at its helm. While the South built its new government, the North watched with dread. Outgoing President James Buchanan wrung his hands, insisting that secession was illegal, but claiming he lacked power to stop it. Federal forts in the South flew the stars and stripes, but stood increasingly isolated as state militias claimed arsenals and custom houses. Attention turned to the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Virginia. Their fate would shape the conflict to come. Kentucky's location was so vital that Lincoln remarked, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Maryland's loyalty was equally crucial, for Washington, D.C. would be indefensible if surrounded by hostile territory. These states hovered between Union and Confederacy, their populations divided, their leaders cautious, knowing that one wrong step could plunge their soil into war. Efforts at compromise flickered, like dying embers. The aged Senator John Crittenden proposed amendments that would guarantee slavery south of the Missouri line forever. Some urged a national convention to find common ground, but Republicans refused to enshrine slavery's expansion, and secessionists scoffed at concessions. Trust had withered. Suspicion ruled. In Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln prepared for his journey to Washington. He received visitors in a modest office, reading letters from across the nation. Pleas for peace, warnings of danger, threats of assassination. His words to neighbors before departing captured both humility and resolve. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. As he traveled eastward, trains carried him through crowds that gathered at every stop. Some cheered, some jeered, all stared at the man upon whose shoulders the Republic now rested. In Philadelphia, he raised a flag over Independence Hall, declaring his devotion to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Yet at Baltimore, whispers of plots to kill him forced a secret detour under cover of night. By the time he reached Washington in February, the capital was a city under guard, soldiers stationed at intersections, cannon hidden in the shadows of unfinished buildings. The Confederate States of America, meanwhile, celebrated its birth. Its constitution resembled that of the United States, but with guarantees protecting slavery at its core. Richmond newspapers hailed it as a purer republic, one that upheld the rights of white men without what they saw as the tyranny of northern interference. Davis took the oath of office beneath gray skies, warning that though the Confederacy sought peace, it would never surrender its independence. The winter of 1861 thus passed in anxious suspense. Federal forts still dotted southern harbors, symbols of Union authority in lands that no longer recognized it. Charleston's Fort Sumter stood as the most visible flashpoint, a fortress where Major Robert Anderson's small garrison flew the Union flag over waters now patrolled by Confederate batteries. Both sides knew that sooner or later the guns would speak. For ordinary citizens, the months between election and war felt like living atop a rumbling fault line. Farmers in Pennsylvania read newspapers predicting secession's collapse within weeks. Planters in Mississippi drilled militia companies in anticipation of invasion. Merchants in New York worried about Southern debts and trade, while enslaved men and women in cotton fields listened to whispered rumors that freedom might be near. The Union still existed on paper, but in hearts and homes it was already divided. By March, Lincoln stood upon the steps of the Capitol to deliver his inaugural address. The dome above him remained unfinished, its iron ribs stark against the sky, a fitting symbol of a nation still incomplete. His words pleaded for unity. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Yet behind his appeals lay firmness. The Union was perpetual, and he would enforce the laws of the United States. The crowd dispersed, knowing that peace balanced on a knife's edge. Compromise had failed, secession had spread, and two governments now claimed legitimacy across the same land. It would take only one spark to transform uncertainty into war. That spark lay waiting in Charleston Harbor. There, a stone fortress stood as the last reminder of federal authority in South Carolina. Fort Sumter had been constructed to guard one of the South's busiest ports, and by early 1861, it became the symbol of the Union's determination to hold its ground. Inside its thick walls, Major Robert Anderson commanded fewer than 100 men. Supplies dwindled by the day, and the garrison lived under the shadow of newly built Confederate batteries surrounding the harbor. The new government in Montgomery could not tolerate the flag of the United States flying above Sumter. President Jefferson Davis authorized General P.G.T. Beauregard, Anderson's former pupil at West Point, to demand surrender. When Anderson refused, Confederate guns opened fire on April 12, 1861. For 34 hours, cannon thunder echoed across the bay, shells arching through the smoke until flames spread through the interior of the fort. Not a single man on either side was killed during the bombardment, yet its political effect was immediate and irreversible. News traveled swiftly by telegraph. In Washington, President Lincoln received word that the garrison had evacuated after exhausting its ammunition. Across northern states, church bells rang and crowds gathered, anger turning into determination. The attack convinced many who had favored compromise that war was now unavoidable. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he termed an insurrection. The response exceeded expectations, with thousands enlisting within days. The Confederacy also mobilized. Volunteers poured into state capitals from the Carolinas to Texas, carrying hunting rifles, shotguns, or nothing at all, expecting local authorities to provide equipment. Richmond, Nashville, and New Orleans saw parades of young men in homemade uniforms, some stitched from household fabric, their families watching with pride and fear. The president's proclamation transformed the political map. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which had hesitated in the winter months, now chose to secede. Their leaders argued that Lincoln's call to arms revealed the true intention of the federal government, to use military force against fellow Americans. With their departure, the Confederacy nearly doubled its population and gained Virginia's industrial resources and strategic position. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri did not follow, though each state faced intense internal division. Maryland's proximity to Washington meant federal troops occupied key points to ensure the capital's safety. In Kentucky, Governor Beriah Magoffin declared neutrality, a position that satisfied neither camp. Missouri witnessed open conflict as Unionists and secessionists clashed in towns along railroads. Borderland loyalty was uncertain, and both governments understood the stakes. The initial enthusiasm for the war on both sides carried a sense that the conflict would be short. Crowds cheered departing regiments. Women pinned ribbons on uniforms, and newspapers predicted victory within months. In the North, many believed that the Union's larger population, stronger economy, and greater industrial capacity guaranteed quick success. In the South, confidence rested on martial tradition, the belief that superior fighting spirit could overcome numbers, and the expectation that cotton would secure international support. The Union began forming a strategy to strangle its opponent. General Winfield Scott, the aged hero of the Mexican War, proposed a broad plan to blockade southern ports and gain control of the Mississippi River, thereby dividing the Confederacy. Critics mocked his Anaconda plan as slow and cumbersome, yet its outline would guide Union efforts for the rest of the conflict. Lincoln also pressed for rapid action to demonstrate strength, hoping to prove that rebellion could be subdued with one decisive campaign. For the Confederacy, the approach was defensive with flashes of offense. Leaders expected that if they could hold territory and inflict enough casualties, the North would tire of the struggle. They placed hope in recognition from Britain or France, nations whose textile industries depended on Southern cotton. Confederate diplomacy began immediately, sending envoys across the Atlantic to argue that their independence served European interests. The organization of armies revealed the chaos of sudden mobilization. Local communities raised companies, often electing their own officers. Regiments took shape from clusters of neighbors and kin. Discipline was loose, equipment varied, and training often consisted of little more than parade drills. Despite the shortcomings, morale was high. Men believed they would soon return home after teaching their adversaries a swift lesson. In the north, regiments drilled in camps hastily erected outside major cities. Washington itself became a garrison town, with soldiers patrolling streets and bivouacking in public buildings. The city bristled with defensive works as officials feared a Confederate march on the capital. In the South, Richmond became the new seat of government after Virginia's secession, chosen for its industry and proximity to the front. The shift also brought the war directly to the fields of Northern Virginia. Both sides scrambled for competent leadership. The Union placed initial hope in General Irvin McDowell, a capable organizer but inexperienced in leading large forces in the field. The Confederacy looked to Beauregard, already celebrated for his role at Sumter, and Joseph E. Johnston, a veteran of earlier wars. From the outset, the war revealed itself to be not only a test of armies, but of the men chosen to command them. Finances posed another challenge. Congress authorized borrowing and taxes to fund the Union's effort, while the Confederacy relied heavily on printing paper currency, which quickly lost value. Both governments discovered that enthusiasm could raise armies, but sustaining them required organization, supply, and discipline. By early summer, momentum gathered toward a confrontation. Political leaders and public opinion in the North demanded action. Pressure mounted for a march into Virginia to capture Richmond and end the rebellion. McDowell assembled his forces outside Washington, drilling recruits while newspapers clamored for advance. Lincoln, aware of their inexperience, hesitated, but finally yielded to political necessity. Orders went out for a move toward Manassas Junction, where railroads intersected, making it a valuable target. The Confederate leadership understood the significance of Manassas as well. Beauregard concentrated his forces there, hoping to block the Union's advance. Johnston, positioned in the Shenandoah Valley, stood ready to reinforce by rail if opportunity allowed. Both armies prepared to test their strength in what many believed would decide the entire conflict. As July approached, soldiers on both sides remained full of confidence. In camp, they wrote letters home describing their eagerness for the coming clash. Northern regiments sang songs about marching through Dixie, while Southern troops spoke of defending hearth and homeland. Civilians even traveled with picnic baskets, expecting to watch a battle near Washington as if it were an entertainment. The war that began with a bombardment in Charleston Harbor was now rushing toward its first great land engagement. Neither side yet comprehended the scale of the struggle ahead, or the years of sacrifice required. What began as mobilization and enthusiasm would soon give way to the shock of real battle. The Union Army moved out from Washington in mid-July, columns of green recruits marching southward in the summer heat. Their destination was Manassas Junction, where Confederate forces had gathered to block the road toward Richmond. General Irvin McDowell led the advance, commanding an army of about 35,000. His men carried new flags and untested weapons, some with uniforms still bright from the seamstress's table. Confidence was high. Many believed that one decisive blow would settle the matter. Confederate Commander P.G.T. Beauregard waited near a stream called Bull Run. His troops numbered fewer than McDowell's, but reinforcements under Joseph E. Johnston were close at hand, moving from the Shenandoah Valley by rail. It would be the first time in history that railroads played such a direct role in transferring troops to a battlefield, a sign that modern technology would shape this war as surely as muskets and bayonets. On July 21st, McDowell ordered his men forward, Union columns crossed Bull Run at several points, hoping to turn the Confederate left. Early progress seemed promising. Northern troops pushed back outnumbered defenders and gained ground on the plateau near Henry House Hill. Some officers believed victory was near. Civilians who had followed the army from Washington with wagons and picnic baskets watched from nearby ridges, certain they were witnessing the rebellion's swift collapse. But the Confederates held firm. On Henry House Hill, Virginia troops under Thomas J. Jackson stood fast amid the confusion. His brigade formed a solid line, repulsing charge after charge. Observers noted his calm presence in the midst of smoke and fire, and a fellow officer remarked that he stood like a stone wall. The nickname followed him from that day forward, Stonewall Jackson, destined to become one of the South's most celebrated figures. As the afternoon wore on, Johnston's reinforcements arrived by train and marched straight onto the battlefield. The tide turned. Confederate counterattacks broke Union lines, sending inexperienced soldiers into retreat. What began as an orderly withdrawal dissolved to panic as wagons clogged the roads and frightened men fled back toward Washington. Cannon and supplies were abandoned along the route. The first major battle of the war ended with a decisive Confederate victory. The result shocked the North. Newspapers that had predicted an easy triumph now printed accounts of chaos and loss. The public realized that the war would not be quick. McDowell was replaced by George B. McClellan, a young general who had achieved success in Western Virginia. McClellan arrived in Washington with energy, reorganized the Army of the Potomac, and began the long process of training recruits into disciplined soldiers. His organizational skills inspired confidence, though his caution would later frustrate political leaders. In the South, the victory at Bull Run sparked jubilation. Crowds filled streets to cheer their soldiers, convinced that independence was within reach. Some leaders even suggested that a march on Washington might end the conflict immediately. Yet Confederate forces were too disorganized to exploit their success. They remained near Manassas, strengthening defenses while the larger struggle unfolded. The war expanded beyond Virginia. In the Western Mountains, Unionists in Virginia's northwestern counties opposed secession. They resisted Richmond's authority and petitioned for statehood. By the end of the year, their efforts laid the groundwork for the creation of West Virginia, a state loyal to the Union carved from Confederate territory. On the seas, Lincoln's administration began enforcing a blockade of southern ports. Warships patrolled the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico, aiming to choke off cotton exports and deny supplies to the Confederacy. The effort started slowly. Too few ships covered too many miles of coastline, but the strategy marked the beginning of a long economic squeeze. Smugglers and blockade runners still slipped through, yet every captured vessel reminded the South that isolation threatened its survival as much as battlefield defeat. The summer and autumn of 1861 also revealed the depth of division within border states. Missouri descended into violence when pro-secession Governor Claiborne Jackson clashed with Unionist forces. Skirmishes broke out near St. Louis, and guerrilla warfare spread through the countryside. Kentucky's declaration of neutrality collapsed under pressure as Confederate troops entered the state, prompting federal forces to secure key positions. Control of these borderlands became a contest as vital as the campaigns in Virginia. Volunteer armies swelled on both sides. Training camps filled the landscapes of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Georgia. Men drilled with wood muskets until real weapons could be supplied, while women organized aid societies, collected bandages, and sent boxes of food to the front. The war touched nearly every community. linking distant farms and towns to the fate of soldiers at the front. Diplomacy entered the picture late in the year. Confederate leaders believed that European nations, especially Britain and France, might intervene to protect cotton supplies. Though no recognition came in 1861, Southern hopes remained fixed on the idea that international pressure could secure legitimacy. For the moment, foreign governments watched cautiously, unwilling to commit until events on the battlefield revealed the rebellion's staying power. Through the final months of the year, both sides prepared for campaigns to come. In Washington, McClellan drilled his men in elaborate reviews that impressed onlookers, but delayed offensive action. Lincoln grew impatient, eager for progress that would restore confidence. In Richmond, Davis faced the challenge of unifying states jealous of their rights under a central government. Confederate armies needed weapons, clothing, and food, and already shortages began to bite. By the close of 1861, the war had spread across a continent. Virginia, Missouri, and Kentucky had all seen bloodshed. The Mississippi River became a prize that both sides coveted. Naval squadrons patrolled the coasts, while diplomats sought friends abroad. The early belief in a quick settlement was gone. Instead, Americans on both sides realized that they faced a long, grueling conflict whose outcome no one could predict. The new year brought no pause in the conflict. Both governments recognized that the war would be neither short nor easy, and each sought ways to gain the advantage. By 1862, attention turned to the rivers and railroads of the Western Theater and the marshy peninsula of Virginia, where Union commanders hoped to strike at Richmond itself. In the West, a rising figure came to the forefront. Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet officer with unremarkable early service, found himself in command of forces along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. His plan was straightforward: seize Confederate forts that guarded the waterways and open a path into the South. In February, he moved against Fort Henry, a stronghold on the Tennessee. Union gunboats under Andrew Foote pounded the fort with heavy fire, and Confederate defenders abandoned their position. Grant quickly turned toward Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. This post was far stronger, its earthworks commanding the river and protecting routes into Tennessee. The battle raged for days. Confederate generals John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Buckner debated whether to fight their way out or hold. A fierce assault briefly opened an escape route, but hesitation cost them the chance. When Grant demanded unconditional surrender, Buckner yielded. 12,000 Confederates marched into captivity, the largest capture of Southern troops thus far. The victory electrified the North. Grant became a national name, and the phrase unconditional surrender attached itself to his initials. The fall of Forts Henry and Donelson forced the Confederacy to abandon much of Kentucky and opened Tennessee to Union invasion. Nashville fell soon afterward, the first Confederate state capital to be occupied. Union flags now flew over courthouses and river landings, where secession had once seemed secure. Control of the rivers remained central. With each mile of the Mississippi and its tributaries, Union gunboats advanced. The river network acted as highways for armies and supply lines. Every captured town weakened Confederate communication and strengthened the federal grip on the interior. The most dramatic contest came in early April at a small Methodist meeting house in Tennessee called Shiloh Church. Grant had advanced south along the Tennessee River and encamped near Pittsburgh Landing, awaiting reinforcements from Don Carlos Buell. His men, many still green, scattered across fields and woodlots with little thought of imminent danger. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston seized the chance to strike. On April 6th, his army launched a surprise attack. Union camps erupted in chaos as soldiers scrambled from their tents. The fighting surged back and forth through peach orchards and along sunken roads. Johnston himself rode at the front until he fell mortally wounded, bleeding to death before his staff realized the seriousness of his injury. Command passed to Beauregard, who pressed the assault. Union troops rallied along a defensive line near the river. Naval gunboats added their fire, blasting Confederate positions from the water. Through the long afternoon, the struggle continued. When night fell, Grant's army was battered but unbroken. Reinforcements under Buell arrived during the night, swelling Union strength. At dawn on April 7th, Grant counterattacked. The Confederates, exhausted and without Johnston's leadership, fell back. By the end of the second day, they retreated toward Corinth. Shiloh stunned the nation. More than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, a toll greater than all previous American wars combined. Northern newspapers accused Grant of negligence for being surprised, while Southerners mourned Johnston, considered one of their best commanders. The scale of bloodshed revealed what kind of war lay ahead. While armies clashed inland, the Union Navy struck at the coast. In April, Admiral David Farragut led a daring assault against New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest city and vital port at the mouth of the Mississippi. His fleet braved fire from forts guarding the river, ran past chains and obstructions, and engaged Confederate vessels. After fierce fighting, Farragut forced passage. On April 25th, Union forces entered New Orleans. Crowds watched in silence as the Star and Stripes was raised above city buildings. The fall of New Orleans cut off the South's largest commercial center and denied access to the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, in Virginia, attention focused on George B. McClellan. Since reorganizing the Army of the Potomac, he had created a formidable force of over 100,000. Soldiers admired his training and discipline, calling him Little Mac. Yet his reluctance to risk battle worried President Lincoln. McClellan believed he faced overwhelming enemy numbers and pressed for elaborate preparations. His plan, known as the Peninsula Campaign, aimed to bypass strong defenses in northern Virginia by transporting his army by water to the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers, then advancing on Richmond. In March, his troops embarked on hundreds of vessels, creating one of the largest amphibious operations in American history. They landed near Fort Monroe and began the slow march toward the Confederate capital. Opposing him was General Joseph E. Johnston, who withdrew to a defensive line near Yorktown. McClellan, convinced he faced massive numbers, spent weeks preparing siege works instead of pressing forward. By the time he advanced, Confederates had fallen back closer to Richmond. In May, Johnston struck at 7 Pines, Fair Oaks, hoping to catch the divided Union army. The fighting was brutal, with heavy losses on both sides. Johnston was severely wounded, leaving command open. Into that role stepped Robert E. Lee, previously Davis's military advisor. Many in Richmond doubted him, remembering his cautious service in Western Virginia. Yet Lee immediately reorganized the army, renamed it the Army of Northern Virginia, and prepared to confront McClellan with aggressive maneuvers. Late June brought the 7 days battles outside Richmond. Lee attacked repeatedly, seeking to drive McClellan away. The fighting raged through places like Mechanicsville, Gaines's Mill, and Malvern Hill. Casualties mounted. Though McClellan's men fought hard, their commander grew increasingly convinced he was outnumbered and withdrew down the peninsula. Richmond remained in Confederate hands, and Lee emerged as the South's foremost commander. The failures on the peninsula deeply disappointed the North. After the optimism of Donelson, Shiloh, and New Orleans, hopes for a quick capture of the Confederate capital collapsed. Lincoln grew frustrated with McClellan's caution, noting that the Union always seemed to have a vast army doing nothing. Yet McClellan's soldiers continued to admire him, convinced their setbacks came from Washington's interference rather than his decisions. On the southern side, the arrival of Lee gave new confidence. His willingness to take risks contrasted with earlier defensive strategies. The Confederacy, though battered in the west, could still boast that its capital had survived a massive offensive. Morale lifted, and Richmond celebrated the general who would become its symbol of resistance. Away from the main theaters, the Confederate Congress introduced a measure that revealed the strain on manpower: the Conscription Act of 1862. For the first time in American history, a draft compelled service. All white men between certain ages were required to serve, though exemptions for the wealthy or those with enough slaves created resentment among poorer citizens. The law showed both determination and desperation. It allowed the South to keep armies in the field, but it also revealed how quickly voluntary enthusiasm had given way to the necessity of compulsion. By the end of 1862's first campaigns, the war had grown wider, bloodier, and more uncertain. In the West, Grant's victories opened paths deeper into Confederate territory, though at terrible cost. On the river, Farragut's fleet secured control of New Orleans, striking a blow at Southern commerce. In the East, McClellan's grand plan failed, and Lee rose to prominence. Each triumph and setback demonstrated that the struggle would extend far beyond anyone's early predictions. The year had begun with confidence in both capitals. It closed with realization that the conflict was a contest of endurance, resources, and will. Battles at Shiloh, Donelson, and the 7 Days revealed the scale of sacrifice ahead. The Union had learned it could seize strongholds and rivers. The Confederacy had proved it could protect its capital under determined leadership. Neither side held a decisive advantage, but the cost in lives made clear that the war was becoming a national ordeal rather than a brief rebellion. The summer ended with uncertainty. In the West, Union forces gained ground along the rivers, but in the East, the failure of the Peninsula Campaign left Richmond secure. President Lincoln searched for commanders willing to act decisively. Robert E. Lee, meanwhile, seized the initiative and carried the war northward. His goal was more than military victory. He hoped to influence public opinion in the Union, gain recognition abroad, and relieve the burden on Virginia's farms. Lee moved his army into Maryland in early September. The invasion carried risks, but he believed that one dramatic success on northern soil could shake Lincoln's government. McClellan, restored to command after John Pope's defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, shadowed the Confederate advance. His caution remained, yet fortune handed him a rare chance. Union soldiers discovered a misplaced copy of Lee's orders wrapped around cigars. The document revealed the division of Confederate forces and their movements. McClellan held in his hand what should have been the key to a decisive victory. Even with this intelligence, McClellan delayed. His hesitation allowed Lee to gather strength near the small town of Sharpsburg, beside a creek called Antietam. On September 17, 1862, Union forces attacked. What followed became the bloodiest single day in American history. The morning assault struck the Confederate left through a cornfield that quickly became a killing ground. Men advanced and fell in waves. Stalks cut down with them until the ground was littered with bodies. In the center, Union soldiers charged a sunken road that defenders turned into a natural trench. Hours of musket fire piled men 3 deep. the path forever after, called the Bloody Lane. On the southern flank, Union troops crossed Antietam Creek at Burnside's Bridge under withering fire from Georgians positioned on high ground. Progress came only after repeated attacks. By evening, both armies were shattered. Nearly 23,000 casualties lay across the fields, killed, wounded, or missing. Neither side could claim a clear tactical victory. Lee held his ground, but eventually withdrew across the Potomac, ending his invasion. McClellan, despite superior numbers and the knowledge of Lee's divided forces, failed to destroy the Confederate army. Yet strategically, the day belonged to the Union. Lee's retreat denied him the triumph he sought on northern soil. For Lincoln, Antietam provided the opening he had waited for. He had long considered a proclamation of emancipation, but feared issuing it after defeat would seem desperate. Now, with Lee's advance halted, he acted. On September 22nd, he announced that unless the Confederate States returned to the Union by January 1st, 1863, their enslaved people would be declared free. The Emancipation Proclamation redefined the war. Until then, the Union had fought primarily to preserve the nation. Now, it also fought to end slavery in rebellious states. The decree did not apply to loyal border states or areas already under Union control, but its symbolic power was immense. Enslaved men and women heard the news with hope, interpreting it as a promise of liberation tied to Union victory. Abolitionists rejoiced that the struggle for freedom had at last become official policy. The proclamation carried international consequences. Britain and France had watched closely, considering recognition of the Confederacy. Many in Europe sympathized with Southern independence, but once the Union declared the fight a battle against slavery, the calculus changed. Public opinion in Britain, especially among working classes opposed to bondage, made open support for the South politically impossible. Diplomats in London and Paris turned away from intervention. This change also transformed the Union Army. The government now authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. Recruitment began slowly, but by war's end, nearly 180,000 African American men would serve in the federal ranks, about 1/10 of the entire force. Their participation not only added manpower, but also gave the struggle a moral dimension that no retreat could erase. Meanwhile, the conflict pressed on with renewed ferocity. In December 1862, Union forces under Ambrose Burnside attempted to seize Fredericksburg, Virginia. The attack proved disastrous. Federal troops charged repeatedly across open ground against fortified Confederate positions on Murray's Heights. The result was slaughter. Thousands fell in futile assaults. The defeat plunged Northern morale into despair once more. A stark reminder that emancipation had not guaranteed military success. Yet even amid setbacks, the larger currents shifted. The South could claim battlefield victories, but it could not undo the proclamation's political weight. Every enslaved person who fled to Union lines weakened the Confederate economy and strengthened the Northern cause. Plantations struggled as laborers left or resisted. The promise of freedom created pressure that no Confederate law could counter. Lincoln himself recognized the magnitude of what had begun. In private letters, he admitted that he had taken a step from which there was no retreat. The nation's struggle was now bound to the fate of 4 million enslaved people. The war for Union had become a war for liberty. By the close of 1862, both sides understood that they faced a prolonged contest. The Union had halted Lee's first northern advance and claimed the moral high ground through emancipation. The Confederacy, though battered, still stood, its armies unbroken and its people determined. But the terms of the struggle had changed forever. No compromise settlement could restore the Union as it had been. Victory, whenever it came, would have to secure both national unity and human freedom. While armies in Virginia clashed over control of Richmond, the Western theater drew attention to the lifeline of the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled its waters would command movement of men and supplies across the heart of the continent. For the Union, seizing the river meant cutting the Confederacy in two and strangling its ability to wage prolonged war. For the South, holding the fortress city of Vicksburg was essential. Perched high on bluffs, with cannon commanding every bend, it became known as the Gibraltar of the Mississippi. Union strategy aimed at tightening its grip from both north and south. In Tennessee, Ulysses S. Grant continued advancing along rail and river. His capture of Fort Donelson had already forced Confederate retreats, but control of the state was not secure. At Shiloh, he had learned how costly victory could be. Now he prepared for a campaign that would lead toward Vicksburg. The opening moves came in Kentucky. Confederate General Braxton Bragg attempted to shift the balance by marching north in the autumn of 1862, hoping to rally support in a state divided between Union and secession. His army clashed with Don Carlos Buell at Perryville in October. The battle was fierce, fought under sweltering heat and with both sides short on water. Though tactically indecisive, the engagement forced Bragg to withdraw southward, ending Confederate hopes of bringing Kentucky into their ranks. The state remained under Union control, a blow to Southern strategy and a relief to Lincoln, who had called its loyalty essential. In central Tennessee, fighting continued at year's end. Bragg, still commanding the Army of Tennessee, regrouped near Murfreesboro. Union forces under William S. Rosecrans advanced against him. At the Battle of Stones River, which began on the last day of December 1862, both armies fought with desperation. Confederate assaults nearly overwhelmed the Federal line on the first day, but Union troops rallied. When the fighting ended on January 2nd, 1863, Bragg withdrew. Though casualties were staggering on both sides, the Union claimed the field. The victory strengthened Northern morale after the setback at Fredericksburg in Virginia and secured control of central Tennessee. Meanwhile, Grant concentrated on his main objective, the Mississippi. Vicksburg defied easy capture. Swamps, bayous, and shifting channels made direct approaches difficult. Grant tried several maneuvers to reach the city. He attempted to dig canals that would bypass Confederate defenses and allow his transports to slip past, but floods and mud thwarted the effort. Expeditions into the bayous bogged down. Soldiers hacked through trees and waded through waist-deep water, only to find impassable obstacles. These failures tested Grant's patience, but revealed his determination to keep pressing until success came. As he struggled near Vicksburg, naval operations continued downstream. Admiral David Porter supported Grant with gunboats, while earlier victories had already placed New Orleans in Union hands. Together, the Army and Navy sought to squeeze the Confederacy's vital artery. Supplies from Texas and Arkansas, once floated across the river, now faced increasing risk. The South clung to Vicksburg as the keystone of its defense. The Union's growing strength in the West contrasted with challenges in the East. Newspapers reminded readers that while Virginia consumed headlines, real progress came along the Mississippi. Lincoln himself observed that control of the river was key. Once in Union hands, the rebellion would be divided and weakened beyond repair. Confederate civilians felt the pressure. Farmers in Mississippi and Louisiana faced federal raids that destroyed crops and seized livestock. Plantations near the river saw enslaved workers escape across to Union lines, where emancipation and military service beckoned. Every loss reduced the resources available to sustain Southern armies. The broader Western campaigns revealed a pattern. Union armies, though suffering heavy losses in battles like Shiloh and Stones River, managed to hold territory and push forward. Confederate forces, despite brave stands, found it difficult to regain ground once lost. Bragg's retreat from Kentucky and Tennessee symbolized this imbalance. The South could still strike, but it lacked the strength to sustain long offensives in the region. Back at Vicksburg, Grant refined his plans. By early 1863, he determined to move his army down the west bank of the river, cross below the city, and strike from the rear. It was a bold maneuver that would require coordination of land and naval forces, but Grant believed it offered the best chance of success. The campaign that followed would become one of the most daring in the war. Until then, the struggle for the Mississippi remained in suspense. Confederate leaders boasted that Vicksburg was impregnable, while Union soldiers muttered that the bluffs mocked every effort. Yet the steady pressure told its own story. With every month of fighting, the river slipped further from Confederate hands. Beyond the military operations, the Western campaigns shaped the political climate. Victories at Donelson, Shiloh, and Stones River reassured Northern voters that progress was possible. They also gave Lincoln the confidence to stand by emancipation as a war aim, knowing that military success in the West balanced setbacks elsewhere. For the Confederacy, the losses deepened internal strains. Draft laws, taxation, and shortages stirred resentment among civilians, particularly in regions now exposed to constant raids. As 1863 began, two great struggles loomed. In the East, Lee prepared for another bold offensive. In the West, Grant tightened his grip on Vicksburg. Together, these campaigns would decide whether the Union's new strategy, war for both unity and freedom, could break the rebellion's backbone. Winter gave little rest to the Eastern armies. After Fredericksburg's disaster, Union confidence sagged. Morale in the Army of the Potomac was low, and newspapers demanded new leadership. President Lincoln replaced Ambrose Burnside with Joseph Hooker, an officer known for both his fighting spirit and his criticism of superiors. Soldiers nicknamed him Fighting Joe, though the title came from a misprinted newspaper headline rather than his own claim. Lincoln hoped that Hooker's energy might revive the Army's fortunes. Hooker reorganized the men, improved camp conditions, and restored discipline. By spring, the Army of the Potomac was again ready for action. His plan aimed to cross the Rappahannock, swing around Confederate defenses at Fredericksburg, and force Robert E. Lee into the open. The maneuver was bold, and in April 1863, tens of thousands of Federal troops began their movement toward Chancellorsville, a crossroads village surrounded by dense wilderness. Lee responded with characteristic daring. With fewer than half the numbers of his opponent, he split his army. He left a portion to hold Fredericksburg and marched west to confront Hooker. Even then, he divided again, sending Stonewall Jackson on a wide flanking march through the woods. On May 2nd, Jackson's corps fell upon the unsuspecting Union right. Panic spread as Federal lines collapsed in confusion. It was one of the most stunning tactical surprises of the war. The Confederate triumph came at a heavy price. As Jackson reconnoitered after dark, his own men mistook him for an enemy and fired. He was struck by multiple bullets and his left arm was amputated. Days later, pneumonia set in, and on May 10th, he died. Lee mourned the loss deeply, saying, "He has lost his left arm, but I my right." The The Confederacy celebrated victory at Chancellorsville, yet Jackson's death deprived it of one of its most brilliant commanders. For the North, defeat bred anger. Hooker's campaign had promised much, but delivered retreat. Lincoln lamented that he could not find a general who would act decisively. Still, the war pressed on, and events quickly shifted the focus northward once more. Lee, emboldened by success, resolved to carry the fight across the Potomac a second time. He hoped to relieve Virginia's farms of constant campaigning, gather supplies from Pennsylvania's countryside, and perhaps win a battle that would shake Northern determination to continue the struggle. Union command changed yet again. In June, Lincoln replaced Hooker with George Gordon Meade, a professional soldier respected by peers, but little known to the public. He assumed leadership just days before Lee's army crossed into Pennsylvania. Federal cavalry under John Buford first encountered the Confederates near the town of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. Skirmishes quickly escalated into full battle. The first day ended badly for the Union. Confederate forces drove Northern troops through the streets and onto high ground south of town. That night, reinforcements streamed in on both sides, setting the stage for one of the largest battles ever fought on the continent. On July the 2nd, Lee ordered assaults against the Union flanks. Fighting raged at places whose names became etched in memory: the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his regiment from Maine held the far left of the line. When ammunition ran low, he ordered a desperate bayonet charge that pushed back the enemy and secured the flank. The day ended with the Union still in possession of the critical ridgeline known as Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Lee, convinced that the Northern center could be broken, prepared for a massive assault on July 3rd. Nearly 13,000 Confederates advanced across open fields toward the Union position. The attack, remembered as Pickett's Charge, moved under heavy artillery fire. As the lines reached the ridge, Northern infantry poured volleys into their ranks. Within an hour, the grand assault collapsed, leaving thousands of Southerners dead or wounded. Survivors staggered back across the fields, and Lee admitted responsibility, telling his men that the failure was his alone. The 3 days at Gettysburg left more than 50,000 casualties on both sides. The scale of suffering stunned the nation. Farms and barns became hospitals, and the town struggled under the weight of dead and wounded. Lee retreated back into Virginia, his hope of decisive victory dashed. Meade, though victorious, declined to pursue aggressively, allowing the Confederate army to escape. Lincoln, while relieved by the result, lamented the lost chance to end the war more quickly. News from Pennsylvania coincided with developments in the West. On July 4th, Vicksburg fell to Grant after a long siege. The twin blows of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the summer of 1863 as a turning point. Union arms had stopped Lee's northern advance and gained full control of the Mississippi. Still, triumph carried its own strains. In New York City that July, anger over the draft law erupted into violence. Crowds, many of them working-class immigrants, rioted for days. They attacked government buildings, set fire to property, and turned their fury on black residents, whom they blamed for the war. Federal troops were rushed from the Gettysburg battlefield to restore order. The draft riots revealed deep divisions in the North and the heavy price of sustaining a long war. Southern morale, meanwhile, wavered. The losses at Vicksburg and Gettysburg undermined confidence in ultimate victory. Still, the Confederacy remained determined, drawing strength from the leadership of Lee and the resilience of its people. For many, defeat only reinforced their resolve to resist what they saw as invasion. The campaigns of 1863 demonstrated the war's shifting balance. The Confederacy could still win on the battlefield, as at Chancellorsville, but each victory came with irreplaceable costs. The Union, despite setbacks, had the manpower and resources to recover and strike again. With the Mississippi secured and Lee checked, the strategic tide leaned northward. By the close of the year, soldiers and civilians alike recognized that the war had entered a new phase. The South no longer threatened to win recognition abroad, and the North had proven it could deliver blows of lasting consequence. The price was staggering, yet the direction of the struggle had begun to turn. When Robert E. Lee withdrew from Pennsylvania after Gettysburg, news traveled westward almost at the same time that another decisive struggle reached its climax. Along the Mississippi, Ulysses S. Grant tightened the noose around Vicksburg. The fall of this stronghold, paired with the check of Lee's army, would transform the summer of 1863 into a moment of lasting consequence for the Union cause. Grant had spent months probing the city's defenses. Earlier efforts through bayous and canals had failed, leaving critics impatient, but he refused to abandon the objective. In April, he launched a bold maneuver, marching his troops down the west bank of the river, ferrying them across below the fortress with the Navy's help, and then striking inland to cut Vicksburg off from reinforcement. It was a gamble, for it meant leaving his supply line exposed. Grant instead relied on the countryside, feeding his army from captured stores as he moved rapidly toward the city. His soldiers fought a series of sharp battles at Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, and Champion Hill, defeating scattered Confederate forces and driving them back into Vicksburg. By late May, Grant's men stood before the city's earthworks. 2 direct assaults failed at heavy cost. The defenders, commanded by John C. Pemberton, held firm behind fortifications dug into ridges and ravines. Realizing that storming the position would only bring needless slaughter, Grant chose to besiege. The siege of Vicksburg stretched into weeks. Union trenches crept closer each day, sappers digging through the hot Mississippi clay. Federal artillery fired steadily, joined by gunboats on the river. Inside the city, civilians and soldiers endured constant bombardment. Families took shelter in caves dug into the hillsides, cooking meals over small fires while shells exploded outside. Food grew scarce. Mules, dogs, and even rats found their way onto dinner tables. The misery hardened both resolve and despair. Pemberton sent pleas for help, but Confederate forces under Joseph E. Johnston, positioned to the east, never mounted a serious attempt at relief. The Union grip was too strong, and the coordination between Grant and Admiral Porter's fleet blocked every approach. By late June, exhaustion and starvation gnawed at the garrison. Letters from soldiers spoke of empty stomachs and hopeless prospects. Civilians begged for mercy. Grant pressed his advantage. Mines exploded beneath Confederate lines, blasting craters that Federal troops rushed to occupy. The circle tightened relentlessly. On July 3rd, Pemberton requested terms. Grant insisted on unconditional surrender, but softened at the prospect of feeding thousands of starving men. He agreed to parole most of the defenders, allowing them to return home rather than march into captivity. On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg capitulated. Union soldiers entered the city and raised the flag over the courthouse. For the first time since the war began, the entire Mississippi River lay in Northern hands. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, declared, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The Confederacy was split in two. Supplies from Texas and Arkansas could no longer reach the eastern states with ease, and morale across the South plummeted. The coincidence of timing magnified the impact. Within days of Lee's retreat from Gettysburg, the Union also celebrated control of the river. Together, the victories marked the war's great turning point. Newspapers that had once doubted ultimate success now spoke of final triumph, though all understood much fighting remained. For Grant, Vicksburg cemented his reputation. Critics who had questioned his methods now praised his determination. He had accepted risks, maneuvered boldly, and held firm under pressure. In Washington, leaders began to see him as the general who might at last bring consistent victories. His promotion to higher command soon followed. The fall of the city also altered the lives of thousands who had been enslaved in the Mississippi Valley. As Union armies advanced, freedom became a tangible reality. Men enlisted in new regiments of the United States Colored Troops, eager to fight for the cause that had emancipated them. Families left plantations to seek safety behind federal lines. Vicksburg's surrender symbolized not only strategic success, but also the spread of liberation along the river. For the Confederacy, the blow was severe. Citizens lamented the loss of their Gibraltar. Newspapers admitted the significance, even while urging perseverance. Jefferson Davis mourned the division of his nation, but sought to reassure that the fight would continue. Still, the sense of inevitability began to grow. With the Mississippi in Union hands, the South had lost one of its greatest advantages: internal communication across a vast territory. The contrast between celebrations in the North and despair in the South illustrated how far the war had shifted in just 2 years. Early Confederate victories had convinced many that independence was possible. Now defeats at Vicksburg and Gettysburg showed that the rebellion could be checked on both fronts. The summer of 1863 also influenced politics abroad. European powers had hesitated to intervene, hoping for signs of Confederate permanence. The twin defeats persuaded them otherwise. Recognition receded as an option. Britain and France, facing their own concerns, saw little profit in supporting a cause that seemed increasingly fragile. Union strategy, too, evolved. With the river secure, attention turned to pressing deeper into the heart of the South. Tennessee became the next stage, where battles around Chattanooga would open the road to Atlanta. At the same time, in Virginia, Lee and Meade maneuvered cautiously after Gettysburg, neither willing to risk another catastrophe. Back in Vicksburg, recovery took time. The city lay battered, its people scarred by months of siege. Yet the reopening of the river unleashed commerce once more. Steamboats carrying federal troops and supplies steamed past the bluffs, symbols of a reunited artery. The Mississippi, which had once divided free and slave states, now flowed under the banner of Union control. The fall of Vicksburg did not end the war, but it reshaped it. The Confederacy could no longer claim to control its own lifeline. Grant emerged as the Union's foremost commander, and the people of the North, buoyed by 2 great victories in 1 week, began to believe that the tide had turned decisively. As summer turned to autumn, new campaigns beckoned. Tennessee became the next theater of decision, where armies would clash at Chickamauga and Chattanooga. Out of those contests, Grant's star would rise even higher, setting him on the path toward overall command. The war that had begun with scattered battles was now entering a phase of grand strategy, with victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg serving as the foundation. The victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg gave the Union new momentum, yet the conflict was far from settled. The Confederacy still controlled vast territory, and its armies remained formidable. As 1863 moved into its final months, the struggle shifted to Tennessee and northern Georgia. where the fate of the interior South would be decided. Confederate General Braxton Bragg held command of the Army of Tennessee. Morale among his men was poor. Disputes with subordinates undermined his authority. Still, he possessed a sizable force and the determination to resist Union advances. Opposing him was William S. Rosecrans, whose Army of the Cumberland had gained credit for victory at Stones River and maneuvered Bragg out of central Tennessee. Rosecrans now pressed southward, aiming to capture Chattanooga, a city whose railroads made it the gateway to the Deep South. In late summer, Rosecrans executed a brilliant flanking movement that forced Bragg to abandon Chattanooga without major battle. Union troops entered the city in September 1863, raising hopes in Washington that progress would continue swiftly. Yet the victory carried danger. Rosecrans, confident that his adversary was broken, spread his forces thin as he pursued Bragg into northern Georgia. The Confederate commander saw an opening. Reinforcements from Mississippi under James Longstreet strengthened his army. On September 19th to 20th, the two forces collided along Chickamauga Creek. The battle became one of the war's bloodiest. Union soldiers fought stubbornly in dense woods. Confusion in orders opened a gap. Longstreet's men surged through, splitting the Federal line. Chaos followed. Rosecrans rode from the field, convinced his army was destroyed. Yet on the Union left, Major General George H. Thomas held firm. His defense on Horseshoe Ridge, where repeated assaults failed to dislodge his men, earned him the title Rock of Chickamauga. As night fell, Thomas withdrew in order, saving much of the army from complete rout. Even so, the Union had suffered a costly defeat. Bragg reclaimed the initiative, besieging Chattanooga. Federal soldiers endured shortages of food and supplies, their situation growing desperate as Confederate artillery shelled the city from surrounding heights. Lincoln recognized the danger and moved swiftly. Reinforcements came from both east and west. Joseph Hooker arrived with troops from the Army of the Potomac, while William Tecumseh Sherman led men from Grant's command in Mississippi. Most importantly, Lincoln placed overall authority in Grant's hands, promoting him to command the Western armies. Grant wasted no time. He reorganized supply lines, famously opening the Cracker Line that brought food into the starving city. With the army restored, he prepared to break the siege. In late November 1863, Union forces launched coordinated attacks. Hooker's men scaled Lookout Mountain in heavy fog, fighting what became remembered as the Battle Above the Clouds. Thomas's troops then stormed Missionary Ridge, charging up steep slopes and overrunning Confederate positions. Bragg's army collapsed in retreat. The victory at Chattanooga secured Tennessee for the Union and opened the road into Georgia. It also confirmed Grant's reputation as the nation's most effective general. By early 1864, Lincoln elevated him to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant now directed strategy across every theater, while Sherman took command in the West. Attention turned southward toward Atlanta. Sherman's task was enormous: to drive through northern Georgia, defeat Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate army, which replaced Bragg after his failures, and capture the city that served as a vital rail hub and industrial center for the Confederacy. Sherman organized a campaign of maneuver rather than reckless assault. Beginning in May 1864, he advanced from Chattanooga with more than 100,000 men. Johnston opposed him with roughly half that number. The Confederate leader favored defensive tactics, entrenching at strong positions to force costly Union attacks. Sherman, aware of the risks, repeatedly flanked these positions, compelling Johnston to retreat deeper into Georgia. The campaign unfolded as a series of moves and countermoves. Battles flared at Resaca, New Hope Church, and Kennesaw Mountain. At Kennesaw in late June, Sherman attempted a frontal assault that failed, leaving thousands of Union casualties. Chastened, he returned to maneuver, eventually forcing Johnston to abandon one line after another. By July, Union troops approached the outskirts of Atlanta. Frustrated with Johnston's continual retreats, President Davis replaced him with John Bell Hood, a young and aggressive officer. Hood launched a series of counterattacks, striking at Peachtree Creek around the city itself on July 22nd, and at Ezra Church days later. Each assault was repelled with heavy losses. Hood's determination could not reverse the tide. Inside Atlanta, civilians endured bombardment and shortages. Factories turned out war material even as shells rained down. The city's importance made it a prize for both sides. For the Union, capturing Atlanta would cripple Confederate logistics. For the South, holding it meant preserving hope. Through August, Sherman tightened his grip. Cutting railroads and supply lines, he forced Hood to abandon the city. On September 2nd, 1864, Union forces entered Atlanta. The fall of the city sent shockwaves across the nation. Lincoln, facing re-election in November, gained renewed political strength. Before the victory, his prospects had looked uncertain. Many feared the war was endless. Now, with Atlanta in Union hands, Northern voters saw proof that progress was real. The capture also prepared the way for Sherman's next campaign. Rather than remain in Atlanta, he planned to march across Georgia, destroying infrastructure and breaking the Confederacy's will to fight. That march would define the next stage of the war. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, John Bell Hood attempted to draw Sherman back by marching north. The result would be another set of clashes at Franklin and Nashville, where Union forces under George H. Thomas would deal decisive blows. Thus, the campaign for Atlanta not only secured the city, but also set in motion battles that would cripple Confederate armies in the West. The events from Chickamauga to Atlanta revealed the evolving character of the conflict. Confederate armies fought fiercely, but could not prevent steady Union advances when resources and coordination tilted against them. Grant's rise to supreme command, Sherman's patient maneuvering, and the political consequences of victory in Georgia all marked the transition to a new phase of total war. By the close of 1864, the Union controlled Tennessee, dominated the Mississippi, and held Atlanta. The Confederacy still resisted, but the balance had shifted further. Sherman now prepared to march to the sea, while Grant fixed his gaze on Lee in Virginia. The end was not yet in sight, but the road to it had opened wider than ever before. When Ulysses S. Grant assumed overall command in the spring of 1864, he did not relocate to Washington to direct the war from behind a desk. Instead, he chose to accompany the Army of the Potomac in the field. George Gordon Meade technically remained the Army's commander, but Grant's presence meant that decisions would be made directly where the fighting took place. His goal was simple: destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Unlike previous leaders, he would not retreat after a single defeat. He intended to keep pressure on the Confederates until they could no longer resist. Lee understood the stakes. With Union resources vastly greater, his only chance lay in making the war so costly that the North would tire of the struggle. Defensive lines, careful use of terrain, and counterattacks at the right moment. These were the tools he hoped could offset Grant's numbers. The campaign opened in early May. Grant crossed the Rapidan River into the dense thickets known as the Wilderness. Here, tangled undergrowth made maneuver difficult, and smoke from rifles hung low among the trees. For 2 days, men fought at close range, visibility measured in yards. Fires ignited by musket flashes swept through dry leaves, consuming the wounded where they lay. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Previous Union commanders would have pulled back after such losses. Grant did not. Instead, he ordered the army to march south, seeking to slip past Lee and continue toward Richmond. Lee pursued and intercepted him at Spotsylvania Courthouse. From May 8th to May 21st, the two armies struggled over fortified lines. At a place later called the Bloody Angle, Union troops attacked a salient in the Confederate works. Fighting raged for nearly 20 hours in driving rain, men grappling across logs and earthworks in scenes of almost unimaginable horror. When the assaults failed to break through, Grant once again disengaged and moved southward. His message to Washington captured his determination. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." By early June, the armies met again near Cold Harbor, only a few miles from Richmond. Here, Lee's men entrenched deeply. On June 3rd, Grant ordered a massive assault. The result was slaughter. In less than an hour, thousands of Union soldiers lay dead or wounded before the Confederate works. Survivors scrawled their names on scraps of paper and pinned them to their coats so their bodies could be identified. Grant later admitted regret for this attack, calling it the only operation he wished he had never ordered. Despite the bloodshed, Grant refused to quit. Instead of retreating north, he swung east and crossed the James River, a maneuver that placed him south of Richmond. His new objective was Petersburg, a rail center vital to supplying Lee's army. If Petersburg fell, Richmond could not be held. Confederate defenders arrived just in time to dig trenches. What followed was not a short battle, but the beginning of a siege that would last for months. The trenches at Petersburg stretched for more than 30 miles, foreshadowing the warfare of a later century. Soldiers lived in narrow ditches, facing constant sniping and shelling. Both armies dug tunnels, constructed redoubts, and endured the sweltering summer in mud and dust. In July, Union engineers detonated a mine beneath Confederate lines, creating a massive crater. Poor coordination turned the opportunity into disaster as Federal troops rushed into the hole instead of around it and were cut down. The crater became another costly failure. While Grant held Lee in place, he directed operations elsewhere to stretch Confederate resources. In the Shenandoah Valley, a fertile region that supplied Lee's army, Philip Sheridan led Union forces in a destructive campaign. His victories at Winchester and Cedar Creek not only secured the valley, but also ensured that its barns, mills, and crops were destroyed. Lee's men, already short of supplies, now faced hunger on a growing scale. The toll on both armies was staggering. Between May and June, Grant lost more than 50,000 men. Lee's losses were smaller in number, but harder to replace. Each skirmish, each trench raid, whittled away at the Confederacy's ability to sustain resistance. Northern newspapers criticized Grant as a butcher, yet Lincoln stood by him, convinced that his relentless pressure was the only path to victory. The men in the ranks experienced exhaustion beyond measure. Campaigning had dragged them through choking woods, muddy fields, and entrenched lines that seemed endless. Letters home spoke of comrades missing, of nights without sleep, of the constant smell of death. Confederate soldiers endured no less. Hunger, ragged uniforms, and the knowledge that replacements were not coming. By autumn, both sides recognized that the campaign had shifted the war's character. Battles like Antietam or Gettysburg had been decided in days. The Overland Campaign was different, a grinding series of clashes that merged into a continuous struggle. Richmond still stood, but it was tied to Petersburg by fragile rails and dwindling supplies. Grant had not destroyed Lee, yet he had fixed him in place. The broader significance became clear in November 1864. With Union victories in the Valley and Sherman's capture of Atlanta, Northern voters returned Lincoln to office. His re-election signaled that the nation would not abandon the war, despite the appalling casualties. For the Confederacy, the hope that political change might deliver independence faded. As winter closed in, the armies dug deeper into their lines around Petersburg. Men built cabins from logs, fashioned chimneys of mud, and tried to survive the cold. Raids and minor battles continued, but both sides knew that the stalemate could not last forever. Somewhere along those trenches lay the breaking point, and Grant intended to find it. The spring of 1865 would bring new offensives and the final collapse of Confederate defenses. Before that moment arrived, however, the soldiers of both armies endured one of the longest and most grueling sieges of the war, a fitting continuation of the relentless campaign that Grant had promised would not end until Lee's army was finished. When Atlanta fell in September 1864, the North erupted with renewed energy, and Lincoln's re-election quickly followed on the strength of Sherman's triumph. For the Confederacy, the loss of its key industrial city was devastating, yet John Bell Hood still commanded a large army and sought to strike northward into Tennessee. Sherman faced a choice: pursue Hood or cut deep into the South. He decided on the latter. With Grant's approval, he prepared to march his forces from Atlanta to the Atlantic, aiming not only to seize territory, but to break the very foundations of Confederate resistance. Sherman believed that war should reach beyond armies to the resources that sustained them. Railroads, mills, warehouses, and crops would all be targets. His purpose was not random destruction, but calculated pressure, to convince Southern civilians that continued resistance was futile. This concept of hard war represented a new stage in the conflict, where the Union sought not just battlefield victories, but the collapse of Confederate society's ability to support the fight. In November, Sherman divided his command into two wings, each about 30,000 men. He cut his own supply lines, relying instead on the land. Foragers, soon nicknamed bummers, fanned out from the columns, seizing food, livestock, and fodder. Bridges and railroads were systematically destroyed, often by heating rails and twisting them around trees, creating what soldiers called Sherman's neckties. The march encountered little organized resistance. Hood had carried his army into Tennessee, where George H. Thomas would later crush it at Nashville. That left only scattered cavalry and state militia to oppose Sherman. Skirmishes flared, but nothing could halt the advance. Georgia's countryside bore the brunt of the passage. Plantations lost barns and cotton gins. Warehouses went up in flames. Enslaved people greeted the columns as liberators, flocking to the army in such numbers that officers struggled to manage the influx. Some were employed as laborers or guides. Others simply followed, unwilling to remain in bondage. The destruction spread beyond material damage. Southern families watched helplessly as fences disappeared into campfires, smokehouses emptied, and livestock driven away. Sherman hoped that by bringing the war to civilians' doorsteps, he would sap the will to continue. Critics in the North worried about the morality of such tactics, while Confederates denounced him as a barbarian. Yet the effectiveness was undeniable. Every mile advanced widened the sense of inevitable defeat. By mid-December, the Union Army reached the coast. On December 21st, 1864, Sherman entered Savannah. The city surrendered without a fight, sparing its buildings from destruction. Sherman telegraphed Lincoln with a simple message: "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition." The gift carried more than symbolic weight. It proved that an entire Confederate state could be marched through at will. The fall of Savannah did not mark the end of Sherman's campaign. His next objective lay northward through the Carolinas, where he intended to join Grant in crushing Lee. But already the march to the sea had demonstrated the new reality of total war. Civilian infrastructure, not just armies, had become legitimate targets. While Sherman carved his path across Georgia, the Western theater saw its own decisive action. Hood's gamble to invade Tennessee ended disastrously. At Franklin in late November, his army suffered terrible losses in frontal assaults against fortified Union positions. Weeks later, at Nashville, George Thomas counterattacked and shattered what remained of Hood's command. The destruction of the Army of Tennessee left the Confederacy with only Lee's force in Virginia capable of major resistance. Sherman's march and Thomas's victory together signaled that the rebellion's backbone in the West was broken. The impact on the enslaved population was profound. With each step of Sherman's columns, thousands claimed freedom. In January 1865, near Savannah, the general met with local black leaders who urged that land be distributed to freed families. Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, setting aside confiscated coastal lands for settlement by freedmen. Though later revoked, the order embodied the aspirations of those emerging from bondage and foreshadowed the debates that Reconstruction would bring. Confederate civilians responded with a mixture of despair and defiance. Diaries record women weeping as homes were stripped, men swearing vengeance, and communities stunned by the speed of the Union advance. Yet others admitted that the scale of the onslaught convinced them further resistance was hopeless. Southern newspapers struggled to explain how an enemy could march unchecked across Georgia, a state once considered secure. Northern reactions were mixed, but increasingly supportive. The destruction alarmed some who feared alienating Southern Unionists, yet the results spoke clearly. Sherman had delivered a blow that no battlefield victory alone could match. By cutting a swath to the sea, he proved that Confederate defenses were crumbling from within. The political context magnified the effect. Lincoln's re-election in November 1864 had already ensured that the war would be prosecuted to conclusion. Sherman's success confirmed that the administration's policies, emancipation, total mobilization, and aggressive strategy were bringing results. In Congress and in the press, voices that had once demanded negotiation now grew quieter. Strategically, the march severed remaining links between East and West. It destroyed Georgia's capacity to support armies in the field and threatened South Carolina, the very state that had led secession. Sherman intended to strike there next, telling his men that the heart of rebellion lay in Columbia and Charleston. Confederate leaders recognized the danger, but lacked the strength to stop him. For soldiers in Sherman's ranks, the march was unforgettable. Diaries describe fields stripped bare, miles of smoking ruins, and lines of freed people trailing the army. Many soldiers felt pride in striking at the rebellion's core. Others expressed unease at the suffering inflicted on civilians. Yet all understood they were part of a campaign unlike any seen before on American soil. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy faced grim realities. Atlanta and Savannah were lost. Tennessee was secure in Union hands. and Lee remained pinned at Petersburg under Grant's relentless siege. The promise of independence that had burned so brightly in 1861 now flickered in the shadows of ruin. The stage was set for the war's final act. Sherman prepared to march north. Grant continued to squeeze Lee, and Lincoln looked toward victory that seemed at last within reach. The road ahead still promised bloodshed, but the direction was unmistakable. The Union's strategy of total war had begun to yield results that no battlefield maneuver alone could achieve. While armies trampled fields from Virginia to Georgia, another front stretched along coasts and waterways. The naval war rarely produced the scale of bloodshed seen on land, yet it shaped the outcome in decisive ways. Control of ports, rivers, and shipping lanes determined who could sustain armies and who faced isolation. From the conflict's opening months, the Union aimed to strangle Southern commerce. The blockade, first mocked as too thin to matter, grew tighter with every passing season. Shipyards in the north poured out new vessels, steam sloops, gunboats, and ironclads that patrolled thousands of miles of coastline. At first, smugglers slipped through with relative ease. But as patrols multiplied, risks grew higher. Captured blockade runners were hauled into northern ports as prizes, their cargoes of cotton, medicine, and weapons confiscated. Southern merchants depended heavily on the swift, low-slung vessels that darted from Bermuda or Nassau to Wilmington, Charleston, or Mobile. Painted grey to blend with the sea and built for speed rather than durability, these ships could sometimes evade pursuit under cover of darkness. Yet every lost cargo meant fewer rifles, fewer blankets, fewer barrels of salt. The blockade became not just an economic weapon, but a psychological one, reminding the South daily of its growing isolation. On rivers, the struggle was equally important. Ironclad gunboats, once experimental, became workhorses of the Union advance. Their armored decks allowed them to withstand fire from shore batteries while delivering pounding blows against forts. Control of the Mississippi and its tributaries had already cut the Confederacy in half. Smaller rivers in the Carolinas, Louisiana, and Arkansas became battlegrounds where local garrisons tried to resist the inevitable advance of steel-clad vessels and troops moving alongside them. Technology gave the naval war its most dramatic moments. The clash of ironclads at Hampton Roads transformed naval warfare worldwide. The Confederate Virginia, built from the salvaged hull of the USS Merrimack, steamed into battle with iron plates that deflected cannon fire. Wooden Union ships shattered under its guns. Panic spread that the Southern vessel might break the blockade entirely. Salvation came in the form of the Union Monitor, a revolutionary craft with a revolving turret. The two machines hammered one another for hours, shot bouncing off armor until neither could claim victory. Though indecisive in immediate result, the encounter signaled the end of the wooden warship's age. Other battles revealed the boldness of Union commanders. Admiral David Farragut, already famous for taking New Orleans, forced passage into Mobile Bay despite the threat of torpedoes, what we would call naval mines. When hesitation spread through his line, he urged his flagship forward, inspiring the fleet to follow. Mobile Bay, one of the last major Gulf ports in Confederate hands, fell into Union control. The cry associated with Farragut's advance became part of the war's legend, symbolizing determination in the face of danger. Confederate naval efforts never matched the scale of the Union's, but ingenuity and daring kept pressure on northern shipping. Raiders such as the Alabama, built in British shipyards, roamed the seas, destroying merchant vessels. American commerce suffered, insurance rates soared, and diplomatic protests raged. Union warships hunted these predators across oceans, until, one by one, they were sunk or driven into foreign harbors. The international dimension of the naval war mattered as much as the fighting itself. Britain, heavily dependent on southern cotton, balanced sympathy for the Confederacy against the need to avoid direct conflict with Washington. The Emancipation Proclamation shifted public opinion decisively. Working men and women in English cities, themselves laboring under shortages, declared that they would not support a cause bound to slavery. European governments, cautious of war with the United States, confined their involvement to quiet tolerance of ship construction in private yards, a tolerance that declined as northern diplomats pressed harder. For enslaved people along the coasts, the arrival of federal ships often meant sudden freedom. Islands off South Carolina, seized early in the war, became sites of experimentation with free labor. Formerly enslaved men and women worked abandoned plantations for wages, sent children to newly established schools, and formed communities under Union protection. These rehearsals for Reconstruction foreshadowed the social changes the war would bring. The blockade and river campaigns also reshaped civilian life inland. Salt, vital for preserving food, became scarce. Medicines that once arrived by ship vanished from stores. Families relied on substitutes, parched rye for coffee, sorghum for sugar, but shortages deepened year by year. Letters from Confederate soldiers begged relatives to send shoes or coats, knowing that the Northern Navy had made it nearly impossible to obtain such goods from abroad. Union gains at sea did not come without cost. Storms wrecked vessels, tropical diseases struck sailors, and monotonous duty along isolated stretches of coast wore down morale. Yet their sacrifices bore fruit in ways less visible than battlefield triumphs. Every port closed, every ship captured, weakened the Confederacy's capacity to resist. By the later years of the conflict, the blockade was nearly impenetrable. Wilmington, North Carolina, remained the last major haven for blockade runners. Its fall in early 1865 symbolized the final tightening of the northern grip. With its closure, the southern coastline was effectively sealed. Naval strength also supported the land campaigns directly. Sherman's march across Georgia depended on coordination with fleets that secured supplies once Savannah fell. Grant's siege of Petersburg relied on control of the James River for transport and artillery support. In these ways, blue water supremacy translated directly into success on land. The naval war stretched beyond the immediate shores of America. Union vessels patrolled far-flung waters, protecting merchant shipping and asserting national presence. In distant ports, the stars and stripes became a reminder that the conflict was watched across the world. Confederate agents, by contrast, found themselves limited to clandestine operations, their hopes for recognition or alliance slipping away. By the time Sherman advanced into the Carolinas and Grant pressed against Petersburg, the outcome at sea was no longer in doubt. The North had achieved what few expected at the start: complete dominance over coastal waters, rivers, and trade routes. The South's reliance on cotton diplomacy and fast ships had proven inadequate against industrial might and persistent blockade. The naval struggle may have lacked the dramatic turning points of Gettysburg or Shiloh, but its steady, relentless pressure accomplished what great battles alone could not. It isolated the Confederacy, starved its armies, and ensured that when collapse came, it would be total. As the blockade tightened and raiders were hunted down, only Lee's army around Richmond and remnants in the Carolinas still held out hope. Sherman prepared to march north from Savannah, and Grant continued his siege at Petersburg. The naval war had done its part. The rebellion was cut off from the world. left to stand or fall on its own exhausted strength. By early 1865, the Confederacy was running on exhaustion. Armies still held the trenches before Richmond and Petersburg, but their numbers dwindled with every skirmish. Supplies grew scarce, morale faltered, and desertion hollowed the ranks. What had once been proclaimed as a new nation now struggled simply to survive each passing week. Southern leaders still hoped for some form of negotiation. Jefferson Davis sent representatives to meet Union officials in a last attempt to find peace without surrender. The gathering at Hampton Roads revealed how far apart the sides remained. Confederate delegates asked for recognition of their independence. Lincoln insisted that the Union was indivisible and that emancipation could not be undone. With no room for compromise, the talks ended, leaving the conflict to be settled by force. Sherman advanced through the Carolinas, while Grant pressed against Petersburg. Sherman's men crossed swollen rivers, tore up railroads, and burned depots, repeating on Carolina soil the tactics that had crippled Georgia. Columbia fell in flames. Charleston was finally evacuated, and the heart of secession saw Union banners raised over its ruins. Refugees crowded the roads, and enslaved people left plantations in droves to follow the marching columns. Each step northward cut deeper into the Confederacy's ability to fight. In Virginia, the lines around Petersburg stretched like a scar across the land. Lee's soldiers dug ever deeper, but hunger gnawed at them as much as Union cannon fire. Desertion increased, with men slipping away to search for food or to return to their families. Civilians in Richmond faced similar desperation. Bread riots had erupted earlier in the war, and by 1865 shelves were bare once more. Grant maintained constant pressure. Sheridan's cavalry swept through the Shenandoah, eliminating what little remained of Confederate supplies there. Federal forces stretched the line around Petersburg until it could no longer be defended. The breaking point came at Five Forks, where Union troops shattered the flank of Lee's position. With that defeat, Petersburg could not hold. The evacuation of Richmond followed. Government officials fled with what documents and supplies they could carry. Fires set to destroy warehouses spread uncontrollably, consuming blocks of the city. When Union troops entered, they found the Confederate capital in flames and its people stunned. Lincoln himself walked the streets days later, greeted by newly freed men and women who saw him as the symbol of deliverance. The sight of the president moving quietly among them captured the moment more than any parade could. Lee attempted to escape westward, hoping to unite with remnants of other Confederate forces. His army, weary and underfed, marched through mud and rain, pursued closely by Grant. Skirmishes erupted along the way, each one further reducing his strength. Sheridan's cavalry cut off escape routes, while Union infantry pressed from behind. The chase drained the last hope of prolonging resistance. At Appomattox Courthouse, Lee found his path blocked. Surrounded and outnumbered, he chose to meet Grant rather than sacrifice his men in futile battle. The two generals conferred in a modest house, Grant in his mud-stained uniform, Lee immaculate in dress despite the circumstances. The terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would surrender their weapons but be allowed to return home, taking with them their horses for spring planting. Officers could keep their sidearms. Grant even ordered that rations be issued to the starving enemy. The surrender did not end all fighting immediately. Other Confederate armies still held out in North Carolina, Alabama, and Texas. Yet the symbolic weight of Lee's capitulation could not be denied. Word spread quickly, and within weeks, Joseph Johnston and others laid down their arms. The rebellion that had begun with cannon at Fort Sumter closed with silence in a small Virginia village. For the Confederacy, collapse came not only from battlefield defeat, but from the cumulative weight of shortages, internal divisions, and unrelenting Union pressure. Desertion had reached staggering levels by 1865. Plantations, once the backbone of the economy, lay in ruin. Railroads were twisted wreckage, rivers blocked, ports sealed. The government had little left to govern. For the Union, the moment was both triumph and burden. Victory preserved the nation and ended slavery, but the cost had been immense. More than 500,000 lives were gone, and scars of destruction covered the land. Soldiers returning home carried wounds both visible and hidden. Freed people celebrated, yet the question of how freedom would be secured in practice loomed large. The collapse of the Confederacy thus marked not an end, but a beginning. The political task of binding the nation together and defining liberty for millions of new citizens awaited. Even as soldiers stacked arms at Appomattox, the debates of Reconstruction gathered on the horizon. With Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the Confederacy's fate was sealed. Other armies laid down arms in the weeks that followed. Joseph Johnston in North Carolina, Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi, and smaller forces scattered through Alabama and Florida. The rebellion that had convulsed the nation for 4 years crumbled into submission. Yet even as the guns fell silent, tragedy struck at the heart of national triumph. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln sought reconciliation. His second inaugural address, delivered only weeks before the end, had called for malice toward none, charity for all. He envisioned a nation healed, not by vengeance, but by justice tempered with mercy. He had already approved generous terms for Lee's men, and urged that Southern states be restored quickly to the Union. Freedom for 4 million people was now secured by the 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in January 1865, and ratified by the states by year's end, abolishing slavery forever. Celebrations filled the capital as news of victory spread. Parades, fireworks, and singing echoed in the streets. The president himself walked among the cheering crowds, appearing more relaxed than he had in years. Yet shadows lingered. Confederate sympathizers, bitter at defeat, plotted revenge. Among them was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor who despised Lincoln and dreamed of reigniting Southern resistance through assassination. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. Booth slipped into the presidential box and fired a single shot. The president slumped forward, mortally wounded. Carried to a boarding house across the street, he lingered through the night. At dawn, on April 15th, he breathed his last. The news spread quickly, plunging the nation into grief. Bells tolled, businesses closed, and people wept openly in the streets. In Richmond, newly freed men and women gathered in prayer, mourning the loss of the man they saw as their liberator. Booth was hunted down and killed days later, and his accomplices captured. But the shock remained. Lincoln had guided the nation through its darkest crisis and would not live to shape the peace that followed. His death turned him into a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice for union and freedom. Meanwhile, the work of binding the country back together began. The surrender of Johnston's army in North Carolina confirmed that organized Confederate resistance had ended. In Texas, soldiers laid down weapons in late spring. By summer, the last commands had disbanded, leaving only scattered guerrilla bands. The Confederacy's fall left enormous challenges. Southern cities lay in ruins. Atlanta, Columbia, and Richmond scarred by fire. Plantations stood deserted or abandoned. Railroads and bridges were twisted wreckage. Millions of newly freed people faced an uncertain future, seeking family members, establishing schools, and negotiating labor for the first time as free men and women. For Union soldiers, the return home was both relief and burden. Veterans carried scars, some visible in missing limbs, others hidden in memories of battles like Shiloh and Cold Harbor. Communities erected cemeteries and monuments to honor the fallen. The human cost was staggering. More than 600,000 dead, countless more wounded, families across every state touched by grief. Politically, the questions of Reconstruction loomed. How would southern states be readmitted? What rights would freed people enjoy? Lincoln's vision of swift reconciliation clashed with others who demanded stronger safeguards for liberty and punishment for rebellion. His assassination left these questions to Andrew Johnson, whose policies would soon generate bitter disputes in Congress. For African Americans, the end of slavery was only the beginning. Some joined the Union Army, even in the war's final months, proud to wear uniforms that symbolized freedom. Others sought land of their own, recalling Sherman's promise along the coast. Churches and schools became centers of community life. Freedom was celebrated with joy, but it also carried the challenge of building new lives in a society still marked by prejudice and resistance. Internationally, the war's conclusion confirmed the survival of the United States as a single nation. European governments that had once considered recognizing the Confederacy now applauded the Union victory. The example of emancipation resonated abroad, strengthening movements against slavery in Brazil and Cuba. The image of a reunited republic carried moral weight that extended far beyond its borders. In the South, defeat brought both despair and resilience. Diaries of the time reveal women writing of ruined homes, men of lost fortunes, and communities struggling to adapt. Yet there was also determination to endure, to rebuild farms, and to preserve dignity amid loss. The legacy of the Confederacy would linger, but its dream of independence was gone. The Civil War's conclusion marked a transformation in the very idea of the United States. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union ended as a struggle that also redefined freedom. The Constitution now banned slavery, and the nation moved into an era of rebuilding. The war had tested whether a republic founded on liberty could survive division. It had, but at immense cost. When Lincoln's funeral train carried his body back to Springfield, thousands lined the tracks in silence. Farmers, shopkeepers, freedmen, and veterans removed their hats as the black-draped cars rolled past. The journey symbolized not only the mourning of a president, but the grief of a nation that had lost so much in the fight to remain whole. The guns had at last fallen quiet, but their echo carried forward into the challenges of peace. Reconstruction, civil rights, and reconciliation lay ahead. The war had ended slavery, preserved the Union, and created a new definition of American nationhood. The task now was to live up to the promise purchased at such a terrible price.